What if holidays were never actually about doctrine? What if what we now call Easter celebrations originated around something far more human: survival, cooperation, seasonal change, food cycles, memory, and hope? And what if religion didn't invent those gatherings so much as absorb them, reinterpret them, and slowly convince people that the meaning of the ritual belonged to heaven more than to humanity? Because one of the biggest costs of superstition is not just that it gives people bad explanations, it disconnects us from our own story. It makes us forget why human beings gathered in the first place, what our ancestors were responding to, and why ritual mattered long before theology tried to own it. I'm not really talking about Easter in a narrow sense. I'm talking about how religion colonized human memory. Religion didn't just reinterpret holidays, it helped disconnect people from the material, social, and seasonal realities that made ritual necessary in the first place. Holidays were once practical human technologies for survival, memory, cooperation, transition, and meaning making. Religious systems often mythologize those rhythms so heavily that people became more loyal to supernatural explanations than to the actual human story those rituals were helping communities navigate. Now, this isn't just about Easter. Easter is one example of a much broader pattern. The pattern is this: once religion attaches itself to a practice, it often stops being treated as one interpretation among many and starts being treated as the interpretation. The religious layer becomes authoritative, the supernatural explanation becomes official, and everything else gets pushed to the margins. That shift changes how people relate to the practice itself. What may have once been open, communal, adaptive, and connected to human life becomes enclosed inside sacred narrative. Now the ritual is no longer mainly something people do together in response to life. It becomes something people are told to understand through doctrine. That's where the problem gets bigger than a single holiday. We're no longer just talking about celebration, we're talking about interpretive control. Religious systems do not simply add stories to rituals. They often place those rituals inside a framework of obligation, orthodoxy, and loyalty. What could have remained flexible and human becomes fixed and guarded. Meaning gets centralized, acceptable interpretation narrows, people inherit the practice already pre explained. So the larger issue is not merely that holidays have religious themes attached to them, it's that religion often positions itself as the rightful owner of their deepest significance. Once that happens, disagreeing with the explanation can feel like violating something sacred, even when what is being defended is not the ritual itself, but a later claim about what the ritual is supposed to mean. That's why the problem is bigger than just one holiday. The real issue is the way religious frameworks can take custody of shared human practices and then treat alternative readings, historical, social, natural, or human centered ones, as if they're shallow, rebellious, or incomplete. And when that persists long enough, people do not just inherit a holiday, they inherit a hierarchy of meaning. Spring celebrations didn't emerge because humans were bored, irrational, or looking for fantasy. They emerged because spring changed the conditions of life. This was not abstract, it was material. The cold began to break, the land began to shift. Days grew longer, movement became easier, planting became possible, animal patterns changed, food prospects changed, human energy changed. For communities living much closer to the earth than most of us do now, these changes were not minor. They affected survival, labor, mood, planning, and social organization all at once. Spring was not just a prettier backdrop, it was a signal, a threshold, a change in what life made possible. That's why seasonal gatherings mattered. They helped people mark the movement from scarcity to possibility. They gave communities a way to respond together to change instead of experiencing it in isolation. They reinforced bonds after difficult seasons. They created moments of shared relief, shared memory, shared anticipation. They gave people structure for transition, and that structure mattered because human beings do not just survive physically, we survive socially, we survive emotionally, we survive through coordination, rhythm, memory, and mutual recognition. So when winter gave way to spring, people were not just noticing warmer weather, they were responding to a shift in the entire logic of life around them. Winter ending meant survival. Longer days meant possibility. Planting and fertility cycles mattered. Communal gatherings reinforced bonds after scarcity. Rituals helped people process uncertainty and transition. That means spring celebrations were never random. They were doing real work. They were practical because they helped communities organize themselves around changing conditions. They were social because they reinforced belonging and cooperation. They were emotional because they gave people a way to collectively register relief, gratitude, and hope. They were even ecological because they were tied to recurring patterns in the natural world. And once you understand that, you can see the deeper loss that happens when those practices get explained only through sacred story. Because then people may continue the outward celebration while losing sight of the human conditions that made the celebration meaningful in the first place. The colors remain, the meals remains, the music remains, the symbols remain, but the underlying rationale fades. What was once connected to season, labor, uncertainty, survival, and renewal becomes detached from those realities and absorbed into metaphysical narrative. And once that happens, people can participate in the ritual without understanding what problem it originally helped human communities solve. That's why this conversation matters. The issue is not simply that religion attached itself to a holiday. The issue is that a deeply human response to seasonal life became overshadowed by explanations that trained people to look past the human meaning underneath. Religion didn't need to erase the practices in order to transform them. In many cases, it was far more effective to keep the practices intact while changing the story attached to them. What may have once functioned as a communal response to the realities of life becomes recast as evidence of sacred history, divine intervention, cosmic struggle, miraculous power, or theological truth. The practice is still recognizable on the outside, but its meaning is no longer anchored in human experience. It's now anchored in doctrine. That shift is more powerful than simple replacement because it allows religion to inherit the emotional force of the ritual while redirecting its significance. People still feel the weight of the season. They still feel the beauty of gathering. They still feel the pull of renewal, gratitude, celebration, and hope. But now those feelings are interpreted through a supernatural script. The religious interpretation is no longer presented as one layer of meaning. It becomes the official meaning, the authorized meaning, the protected meaning. That's where interpretation becomes monopoly. Now the ritual is not just practiced, it's policed. The story is not just told, it's defended. The symbolism is not just inherited, it's guarded. And over time, that enclosure changes people's instincts. Instead of asking where the practice came from, what conditions gave rise to it, or what human function it once served, people are taught to begin with the sacred story and stay within it. The interpretation comes preloaded. The meaning arrives pre approved. And once interpretation is monopolized, recovering the human layer underneath can feel transgressive, even when all you're really doing is remembering that these practices belong to human beings before they belong to doctrine. The cost of superstition is bigger than bad theology. It's bigger than false explanations, and it's bigger than believing things that are not true. The deeper cost is estrangement. When religious frameworks take over human rituals, they do more than change the story. They change how we understand ourselves. They teach us to interpret practices that emerge from ordinary human life through layers of sacred narrative, cosmic symbolism, and supernatural authority. And over time, that changes our relationship to reality itself. We become disconnected from the practical intelligence of our ancestors. We stop seeing ritual as something human communities developed in response to real conditions, real fears, real hopes, real transitions, and real needs. We inherit the practice but lose contact with the problem it was helping people solve. We misunderstand why ritual mattered. Instead of seeing ritual as a part of how human beings organize memory, belonging, grief, celebration, and cooperation, we're taught to see it mainly as an expression of obedience, sacred truth, or divine meaning. The result is that the human function of ritual becomes harder to see, even though that function is often what made the ritual matter in the first place. We become abstracted from nature, seasonality, dependence, and interdependence. Superstition can encourage people to relate to life through metaphysical narrative rather than material reality. Instead of understanding ourselves as embodied, social, ecological beings shaped by time, place, labor, vulnerability, and relationship, we're trained to think in terms of invisible plans, sacred destinies, spiritual warfare, heavenly purpose, and divine symbolism. That abstraction creates distance between people and the actual conditions of life. We learn to see ourselves through myths instead of material reality. And I do not mean myth only in the literary sense. I mean inherited stories that become so dominant that they override observation, history, and human context. People begin to understand their suffering, joy, and future through frameworks that often have more to do with doctrinal loyalty than with reality on the ground. And eventually, we lose continuity with the human story. And that may be the deepest loss of all. Because once human practices are enclosed inside supernatural explanation for long enough, people can become strangers to their own inheritance. They no longer see themselves as part of an ongoing human story of adaptation, cooperation, ritualization, memory, creativity, and ultimately survival. They see themselves primarily through a sacred script. That's why my biggest concern with religious superstition is not only what it does to people in the present, it is that it has abstracted our view of ourselves, not only in the present, but also in the past and the future. It distorts the past by obscuring what our ancestors were actually doing. It distorts the present by misframing the meaning of our practices now. And it distorts the future by making it harder for people to imagine forms of ritual, community, and meaning that are honest, human, and grounded in reality, even though reality is the home of ritual. That's the cost. Not just confusion, not just misinformation, but alienation from ourselves, one another, and the long human story that made rituals possible in the first place. And this is where things get more complicated. Because when people leave religion, they often do something understandable but costly. They reject not only superstition, but ritual itself. The old explanation is gone, the doctrine no longer works, the mythology no longer persuades. But instead of recovering the human layer underneath the religious framing, many people abandon the whole structure altogether. That creates a vacuum. And now a person may become more intellectually honest while becoming less connected to the social practices that help human beings feel grounded, held, and oriented in time. That's the trap. Because deconstruction can remove false meaning without restoring shared meaning. It can expose illusion without rebuilding rhythm. It can free people from superstition while leaving them disconnected from ceremony, seasonality, and collective life. So now people may pride themselves on being rational, skeptical, or disenchanted while becoming even more cut off from the practices that help human beings process change together. And once those disappear, freedom is rarely the thing that people find. Sometimes they just become more private, more detached, less practice in belonging, less able to mark time with others in meaningful ways. That's why reconstruction matters, because the answer to superstition cannot be permanent emptiness. The answer to bad ritual cannot be no ritual. The answer to religious monopoly cannot be cultural amputation. If people leave religion without recovering the deeply human role of ritual, then deconstruction can unintentionally deepen the very disconnection it was supposed to resolve. That still matters because the goal of deconstruction cannot just be to tear down the false explanations. It also has to be to recover honest ways of being human, honest ways of celebrating, grieving, remembering, honest ways of moving through time together. That's what Reconstruction is about. It's about reclaiming ritual without surrendering to superstition. It's about recovering meaning without pretending. It's about building practices that are emotionally resonant, socially grounding, and intellectually honest all at the same time. It's the recognition that human beings still need rhythm. The difference is that now we have the opportunity to do those things with clarity, not because a doctrine commands it, not because a church monopolizes it, not because a cosmic story threatens us into participation, but because we understand what these practices are for. We can celebrate spring because renewal is real. We can gather because community is real. We can reflect because memory matters. We can feast because survival, beauty, labor, and interdependence matter. We can hope because the future is still being shaped by what human beings choose to build together. That's the opportunity in front of us. The future may depend on rebuilding human rituals on honest foundations, not borrowed certainty, not inherited superstition, but honest foundations. Foundations rooted in seasonality, memory, gratitude, interdependence, and shared human need. Because if religion monopolized ritual by pulling it away from human life, then reconstruction means bringing it back to the earth, bringing it back to community, bringing it back to reality, and most importantly, bringing it back to humanity. And that's what I mean when I say keep rising. Keep rising out of illusion. Keep rising into honesty. Keep rising into deeper connection with ourselves, each other, and the long human story we're all still writing. What's at stake here is bigger than just a few holidays. What's at stake is whether we remain disconnected from the human story beneath our traditions or whether we learn how to recover it. Because our ancestors were not just creating decorative costumes or empty folklore, they were building ways to live with change, ways to survive uncertainty, ways to move through hardship together, ways to mark renewal, reinforce belonging, and remember that life doesn't stand still. That's what many religious frameworks buried under doctrine. And that's what many people lose a second time when deconstruction teaches them how to reject superstition, but not how to recover ritual, rhythm, and shared meaning on human terms. So the challenge in front of us is not just to stop believing old stories, it's to become the kind of people who know how to build honest ones, to gather without pretending, to celebrate without mythology, to remember without surrendering our minds, to create rituals that connect us not to fantasy, but to one another, to the natural world, and to the long human story that made us possible. Because if we do not learn how to do that, then we will keep mistaking emptiness for freedom. But if we do, then maybe what comes after superstition is not loss at all. Maybe it's recovery. Maybe it's reconnection. Maybe it's learning how to rise, not out of illusion into nothing, but out of illusion into something more human, more grounded, and more honest. So, if you're looking for a way to move through this season without superstition, but not without meaning, I want to invite you to join us at Bridge City for Rising Season. At Bridge City, we're reclaiming this time of year as a celebration of life, growth, resilience, and human evolution, not through myths, but through intention, not through resurrection stories, but through reflection, community, action, and the decision to keep rising together. That is the heart of Rising Season. This is more than a reaction to religion. It's the building of new traditions, traditions where we reflect on how we've grown. This is a tradition where we tell stories of progress, where we lift each other up, where we honor our connection to the natural world, a tradition where we gather, celebrate, and step into the next season on purpose. So if that sounds like the kind of future you want to help build, come celebrate Rising Season with us at Bridge City. Join us as we mark this season with reflection, conversation, acts of rising, and a renewed commitment to growth, truth, community, and forward movement. Because we do not wait for salvation, we build our future. We do not honor resurrection, we honor resilience, and we rise because it's in our nature to. This season and every season, we rise together. Thank you for joining me for today's conversation. And as always, until next time, keep rising.